I'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Callan. I am the APA Wisconsin Professional Development and Certification Maintenance Officer. And today's webinar is going to be all about the AICP exam. I'm going to let people in here as I go, so just kind of bear with me here. Welcome if you're just joining us. So before we start to talk about the logistics of the exam and the process, I wanted to touch on why AICP. So there's a multitude of different reasons why you might be interested in getting the certification, but a few things to point out are that AICP certification will help distinguish yourself in the profession. So just having that credential is just another thing to add to kind of your credentials as a professional planner. It can help you get an edge in the job market. So a lot of planning positions will have a preferred AICP certification. Often it's not required, at least not here in Wisconsin. I don't see it very often required, but I do see it often preferred. And I often also will see desire to obtain AICP certification depending on the firm or the organization that you're with. It does help demonstrate your skills and planning expertise. That's obviously kind of how you're distinguishing yourself. Part of AICP is getting a well-rounded, broad understanding of planning. So I think that is one specific piece that it does call out. Maybe your work focuses on a certain level of planning, but AICP is one way that you can kind of stay well-rounded in your planning work. Some of that is through the certification maintenance requirements, and some of it's just through networking and different resources that are out there for APA and AICP members. It will help you stay on top of emerging trends. You will join a network of certified planners, so it can help you make those connections, whether it be for improving work that you're doing, working with other organizations for different projects, or getting a different job, or growing your own professional skills. And then finally, one of the key pieces to becoming AICP is committing to a code of ethics. So getting this certification just demonstrates that you have committed to that code of ethics. And I do think that is definitely a big perk or a pro of getting your certification. Feel free as I'm going through this to put questions in the chat. The overall presentation will take about 20 minutes or so, maybe less, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. And anything that comes in the chat I can respond to at that time. All right, so before you decide to really take the dive into getting certified, it's a good idea to kind of run through APA's eligibility pre-check. And they actually have a kind of a process on their website that you can walk through, and that's located at planning.org/certification/eligible. You can just Google it as well. But it's going to just kind of help you through kind of a self-guided process of determining whether or not you're likely to actually be meeting the experience requirements to eventually become AICP certified. As I'll talk about in a minute, there's 3 steps to the process, and one step is applying for your experience to meet those requirements. And so, of course, you don't want to go through the exam process to then find out that your job or your work that you're doing is actually not eligible for kind of the professional planning experience that AICP is looking for. So you'll want to go through and do this. Obviously, if you're a student or you're just getting started out in your career, you may not know what the future holds. I mean, none of us really do, but if you're really not 100% sure about, how what your next career steps will be, but you think they're going to be pretty close to what's outlined there, I think it's probably a safe bet to move forward. But if you're in an allied profession, for example, or you maybe have somewhat of a non-traditional planning job, you'll definitely want to, get a really close look at what those requirements are. So just as the definition of professional planning goes for this purpose, I just wanted to include this information here. So planners help create communities of lasting value by managing change. And the goal of planning is to maximize the health, safety, and well-being of all people living in our communities. And so the AICP Commission has established these 3 criteria that kind of just distinguish professional planners, again, from allied professionals, community stakeholders, elected and appointed officials. And those 3 criteria are that you demonstrate a professional level of responsibility and resourcefulness while applying a planning process appropriate for the project or situation, that you evaluate multiple impacts to a community when implementing professional planning tasks, and that you influence public decision-making in the public interest. So there is a step at the very end of the process, and that I'll talk about more about how you're actually going to provide proof that you're doing these things. But previously, you actually had to submit essays talking about why and how you were doing this before you did the exam. But now, since they've allowed people to take the exam at any time, I think it's really important that you actually do go through this first and make sure that you are going to be eligible, or most likely will be eligible. So the experience requirements, this is another thing just to keep in mind as you're thinking about when you want to take the exam and how you want to move about this process. So the experience requirements vary based on what your education and your work experience are. So if you have a graduate degree in planning from a PAB accredited program, you need that, and then 2 years of professional planning experience to be fully certified. And if you have a bachelor's degree in planning from a PAB accredited program, you need 3 years of work experience. If you have a graduate degree in planning from a program that's not accredited by PAB, also you can have 3 years, although there's a little bit of information also on the eligibility website about how to determine if your program meets those requirements. Most people on this call probably don't have to worry about that, because I think a lot of you are UWM either students or recent graduates, and or from UW-Madison. If you're in one of those programs, you don't have to worry that that's a PA. Those are both PAB certified, or I'm sorry, PAB accredited programs. But then anybody who has other graduate or undergraduate degrees, including associate's degree, would have to have 4 years of planning experience. And then if there's someone who has no college degree or has no degree information provided, you can have 8 years of experience to be fully AICP certified. All of this information is on the website, and I will share this as a PowerPoint PDF, or I'm sorry, as a PDF with everybody on this with the recording as well. So again, before I get into the logistics, one more aspect to consider beyond if your experience will count is the financial side of getting certified. So this is often what I hear a lot of people being hesitant about getting their AICP certification. I think a lot of people would be doing it if it wasn't for the cost associated with it. And so this is definitely something to consider. So there's kind of 2 pieces to the financial requirements or costs associated with getting your certification. So there's an upfront cost, and that comes in 2 parts. And again, I'll go through the details of this, but that's about $510. So that's kind of like your upfront cost to getting certified. And then you also will have annual membership dues that you'll be required to pay to keep your certification. So I always like to bring this up front, because I think it's one of those things that, first of all, it deters people. So you want to make sure you understand, what you're getting yourself into. But you also want to make sure that you're kind of planning for this. And again, I'm not trying to say that these costs are not worth getting AICP certified. AICP certified, I do think it's extremely valuable, but it's just another factor to consider as you're deciding how and when you want to move forward. So a few options for financial support are through your employer. So depending on where you work, you may or may not have some or all of these costs covered. So in some cases, your employer might cover the upfront costs of registering for the exam and getting certified. In some cases, they might cover the ongoing expenses of your member dues, and in some cases, it might be some kind of a quasi, maybe there's an example where they might pay for a certain amount every year, or they might pay for different aspects of continuing maintenance. So for example, they may fund you to go to the conference every year if you are a ICP certified. So if you kind of take those things into account. I did add on here to get creative. So if your employer does not currently support AICP certification financially, I think it's definitely worth a discussion. You could talk to your leadership, your HR department to find out what options might be available. And you could also look at creative ways that you could get supported that may not be a direct payment of your membership dues or your costs. For example, you could look at, would my employer cover time for me to get my certification maintenance credits during work hours? Would my employer cover me time to study during work hours? Would my employer cover my time to actually take the exam? Maybe there's something where you have a certain amount of allotted professional development time in your position description. Maybe you could use that for this. So there's a variety of different things I think you can consider. And there are some resources on the APA website that talk specifically about how to talk to your employer and things like that. But I do think it's an important piece to discuss. There's also a diversity scholarship, which is available to anyone who identifies with an underrepresented population. The purpose of the scholarship is to enhance diversity in the planning profession and expand the number of people from underrepresented communities who are planners. So this scholarship is available for every single cycle. It's relatively easy to obtain. There's basically a one-page form you have to fill out, and most people who apply do get awarded. So keep that in mind. I try to send out information every cycle about this scholarship, and you can also check our website. I try to make sure that gets posted, but each cycle, so there's two test cycles every year. Each test cycle, there is a new scholarship opportunity. So I do try to get that posted and get information out so people can apply. And that can be used to pay for the exam registration fee, the assessment, or both. Depending on how the timing works out, that might be two different applications. And then again, I kind of already talked about this, but as you're getting your certification, you want to think about the upfront costs and your annual membership dues. You can take a look at the salary range schedule on the website, but APA does structure their dues based on what your salary range is, and it's totally self-reported. But it ranges from about $149 for the new member dues, which is your first 2 years, kind of get a discount of $149 a year, and that is the total for both your APA membership and your AICP membership. So there's kind of two pieces once you get AICP certified, and then it can go all the way up to $626 per year for someone with an income of $126,000 or more. So there's a wide range. There's a bunch of different tiers, so you can go on there and take a look at where you might fall at the moment and decide how that fits into your budget. One factor to consider is that once you do get AICP certified, you do have to maintain your membership. So if you decide to let that lapse, you actually have to go back and retake the exam. So it's another thing to consider. Again, I personally I have seen and experienced the benefit of AICP, but it's all something that you kind of need to take into account and be aware of. So getting into the logistics of the actual process for getting your certification. So APA has really streamlined this process over the last few years, and they are now allowing people to take the exam at any time. So previously you used to have to actually get your experience before you could sit for the exam, and you had to write essays to talk about how your experience met their requirements. But now you can go ahead and take the exam as soon as you want. A perk of this is that if you're a student, if you're a relatively new graduate, you might have a lot of the information that's in the exam fresh on your mind. So that's another great reason to take it sooner rather than later. And then another piece of this is that once you do pass the AICP exam, you become an AICP candidate. So it's a credential that you will get just by passing the exam, regardless of whether or not you have the experience. And that, again, is something that you can use as you're going out and looking for a job or looking for different opportunities. And it's also just a perk of being part of the AICP network. So that's something that's a little bit different. But then, as you can see on this chart, there are 2 cycles every year. There's a spring cycle and a fall cycle. So there's a deadline in April and October if you are looking to register for the certification program and schedule your exam. So you're going to want to kind of map out your plan well before these dates, because you're going to want to study and prepare, because the actual exams are in May and November. So you're going to kind of want to have a plan. Like, let's say you're looking at November 2023 for your exam. You're going to want to start thinking about beginning to study for that over the summer and early fall. You're going to want to kind of start mapping out your study plan pretty soon, but then you won't actually register for the exam until October. So you're going to have an opportunity to kind of decide if you're ready to move forward, which is nice. But I certainly would not recommend waiting until October to start studying. That will not be enough time. So just kind of keeping these deadlines in mind. They're roughly the same every year. So you could always keep in mind that if you're right now maybe planning for the fall exam in November, you get to the October deadline and you're not feeling ready or other things have come up, you can always say, okay, I'm going to wait until April, May for the spring cycle. Then after you pass your exam, that's when you're going to have the opportunity to provide educational and professional experience. That's when you're actually going to apply for AICP certification if you have your experience. Now, if you are going to take the test now and wait a couple of years until you get that experience, you're able to continue on as an AICP candidate and then just apply when you're ready. And then, as it mentions here, there is no restriction on that time from when you actually become an AICP candidate and when you apply. So maybe you become an AICP candidate and you're working for a few years. Maybe that work actually doesn't qualify, but you want to keep that AICP candidate designation. You can do that. And then maybe, a few years down the road, maybe you feel like your work has changed a bit and you're able to satisfy those educational or professional experience requirements. So you could even take the exam as someone who hasn't gone through any program. Maybe you're at the beginning of a planning program from an educational perspective. So step 1 in the process is that you are going to register. So registration is open to all all APA members, regardless of your education or experience. So you do have to be an APA member. That's really the only requirement. You again submit that registration when you're prepared to test. So not when you're starting, but when you're actually ready to test. That's when you would pay that first $255 fee. And at that time, you're confirming the understanding of requirements. So you're confirming, your understanding of the education and experience requirements. And you're also going to agree to abide by the AICP Code of Ethics at that time. And then you're also going to schedule your in-person or online remote exam. For the exam, I'll talk a little bit more about those formats in a minute. I'm just gonna pull up the chat really quick. I'm seeing a comment in there. Okay, great. I'll move forward and address those at the end. So step 2 is taking the test itself. So again, the AICP candidate designation can be used by all passing testers. You have to maintain your APA membership to use that AICP candidate designation, and then you will remain an AICP candidate until your minimum experience is earned. So, that should say $0. Oh yeah, that's correct. $0 cost to actually sit for the exam. So once you've registered for that exam, that $255, there's not an additional cost to actually sit for your exam on that day. And then, so after you pass your exam and you become an AICP candidate, and then you meet the education and experience requirements, then you're actually going to apply for full AICP certification. So you're going to provide that education experience documentation, and you're going to provide your work experience documentation. So for the education experience, you're going to actually just have your transcripts. And then for your work experience, there's a number of different, there's a form and there's a checklist that has a number of different criteria that can qualify your experience. And then you're going to provide kind of some very short, I think it's just 1 or 2 essay questions, but it's not even really an essay. It's really just a paragraph or so explaining an example of some of the work that you've done, just so the criteria can be evaluated in a way that shows that you have that level of knowledge and that level of work experience. So this is just the same chart from the last couple slides ago, and this is available on the website, but just kind of wanted to put this here as a reminder. And so then at that time that will be evaluated. And then if that is approved, then you are fully AICP certified. And this is when you actually would pay this second $250 fee. And this time that fee would go towards that full AICP certification application. A little bit more about the experience assessment. I think I already kind of covered a lot of this. But as a reminder, the AICP certification criteria have not changed. So they changed the process a little bit, but the criteria has not changed. You are still going to provide that education and employment history. You're going to include, the different jobs you've had. You're going to have to include contact information for past employers and current employers. And then you're going to have to do this assessment, which is that form where you're going to be demonstrating how your professional experience meets the criteria. And then, as I mentioned, there's checklists, and then there's a couple different open response fields. And I've also included the criteria again on this slide that you should kind of be familiar with if you do the eligibility pre-check, but just to kind of go back and verify this when you're actually applying for the experience requirement. So again, I mentioned this previously, but the eligibility pre-check resources are listed here. So there's a number of different resources. These are actually just 3 of them. But if you're curious of, examples or specifics about what's considered planning experience, there's a worksheet that you can actually fill out, kind of help you define whether or not your experience would qualify. It talks about there's a calculator that will help you understand whether or not your experience is enough years and your education and all those things kind of meet and match together. And then if you do have a degree from a non-PAB accredited school, there's a worksheet that can help you identify if your program meets those requirements. So that's pretty much it for the process. So my next webinar I'm planning to host in the early fall is going to cover a little bit more about what's actually in the exam. And I can talk a little bit about that today as well if people have questions and like a process for studying, things like that. But this is, kind of just really an intro piece. And I do have a Slack channel that I set up. There's a couple of you guys that are on it. I will admit it's kind of sad right now. I'm trying to get it going. I'm trying to get more people on there. But if you're not familiar with Slack, it's similar to like a Teams or another kind of messaging board chat tool, which will allow, my hope is that this channel will allow people who are taking the exam or looking to take the exam to connect and help you form study groups, help you share resources. And then I'll be on there as well, kind of as moderator, answering questions and putting resources out there. There's a few things out there right now, but again, I'm hoping to get some more members to get things moving. But if you are a member on there, feel free to kind of go in there and use it a little bit. A lot of the resources are pretty apparent on the APA website. So I don't want to recreate an APA website on the Slack channel. So I'm trying to get away from like posting a lot of new content, I'll post this on there. I'll post this presentation on there. But I'm really more interested in kind of that dialogue of people who are taking the exam, or maybe people who have recently taken it, people who want to form study groups. But I will put a link to join that group in my follow-up email to this as well. So I believe that's it. So now I'm going to open things up for questions. And I know that Erin Duffer is on the call, and she is currently an AICP candidate. So if we want to just kind of kick off the Q&A with you talking a little bit about your experience, I think that would be great. And I should just clarify too, before you start, Erin, I went through the process in, let me think, I think it was 2018. So it was actually before they moved to the new process. I'm relatively recent, so I do remember, the exam and such, but I did not go through this newer process. So if you want to talk about that, and then I'll answer other questions in the chat.
Yeah, certainly. So I started out as an undergraduate student at Iowa State University in community regional planning, which is a accredited undergraduate program. So currently I'm working to get my accreditation after, or AICP accreditation after my work experience, which comes up in November of this year. So I took the exam last May, and it was right after there was a little bit more of reformatting and restructuring of the exam itself. Partly, I guess I could talk more about if there's specific questions for me, please let me know. I can talk a little bit more about how I prepared to study for the exam, and a little bit more of like my structure of having certain times on the weekends set apart, certain days that I have detailed out. I do see, do you need to have person recommend approval, like a reference? Also, do you need a person to check off on your experience? I guess that would be a question more for you, Liz. I believe you do have to have your work experience verified by your previous employers or current employers. They do fill out a form, as well as you fill out a form detailing kind of things that you've worked on to make sure that you do meet all of their requirements. How much time would you recommend for studying for the exam in advance? So myself, I'm an over preparer and over planner sometimes. So I actually spent about 6 months, probably over 150 hours studying for the exam. I wanted to be as prepared as possible. The pool of questions comes from a wide range of topics, and it can be very specific on certain things. So to organize how you're going to study, sometimes you can focus on certain areas. So say for a couple months here, I will focus on housing acts and really dive into that, brush up on some of the publications that APA submits for journals in regards to housing, brush up on books that have been published from reputable planners over the years, things like that. And then there's so many different Quizlets and other types of platforms like that out there that actually provide previous exam questions that you can do kind of practice exams through that. If you're really wanting to get a really robust and structured program for studying for it, Plan Edizen, you can go through their website, and they have more of like a structured course that details out certain weeks to focus on this, and webinars and teachings on that. But for myself, what I did is I created kind of a master spreadsheet of note taking. I would go through each topic that I knew was going to be covered and try to cover all of my bases on everything. I would write down every single act. I would memorize those acts, fact check them, reference them, and create kind of like a coding platform on the side and saying, okay, this is a publication, this is in relation to housing, this is a housing reform, things like that. So that's kind of how I I managed it. I also talked to people that were also taking the exam at the same time. I think it's really important to get a good working group together, kind of go over some of the things that you are thinking you may be missing, or maybe share exam material, study materials with each other. That's always super helpful. And I guess just setting some time away and focusing on it and being dedicated is the best thing you can do. Be confident in your answers, but also really focus on ethics throughout everything that you're studying. Memorize the code of ethics for AICP, like to the details, very much memorize it, and put that into your frame of mind every time you're studying each topic as well, because the exam itself is very much structured around ethics. So for example, you could have a question that asks something very specific of when was this act originated from, or who is the founder of the Garden City movement. But then it could also be more open-ended, where you could have multiple correct answers, but which one could be the best answer there. So there's definitely different ways that they're going to ask you questions. So just brush up as best as you can with the different resources that are out there with practice exams, and talk to people is my best advice. See another question. Is there a specific number of hours required for experience, or is it just measured in years? Would part-time planning internship count, or only full-time work eligible? I guess that would be a question more for Liz.
Yeah, so I think for that one, they allow you to kind of combine part-time experiences to one. So it is generally like the number of years is kind of calculated as if you were working full-time. So let's say you worked part-time for 4 years, like half-time specifically, then you could count that for 2 years of planning experience. And yeah, thanks, Erin. That's so great. Like, I love hearing kind of specifically what people do to study and map out their plan. Just one other question that I wanted to respond to, or there's a couple here in the chat. So a specific person to recommend approval, there is not like a specific, like you might be applying for a job and they're like, we want 3 references and we're going to call these people, but you do have to put in contact information for your past employers to verify your work. And I think it's possible that they might ask questions about things that you worked on. I honestly don't know a lot about that, like, verification process. But I do think, it should be relatively straightforward in the documentation. I don't think they're trying to like hide anything. But if you go through that eligibility pre-check, that would definitely help. There was,
Oh, you're muted, Liz.
thank you. There was a question about the topics covered. And so I'll just go over those very briefly, but I also put a link in there. There are 9 major topic areas. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, I think you already touched on this, Erin, but the biggest, probably in my opinion, the biggest challenge of this exam is the breadth of the topics. So it's not only the breadth, but it's also, you do have to know quite a bit about each topic. So I think that's just sheer time that's required to study that amount of material. It's easy to get overwhelmed by how much you have to study. So I think what you said, Erin, is like breaking it into bite-sized pieces for a couple weeks at a time, or, however you kind of map out your study plan based on how much time you have. Just kind of focusing on one area and doing that, and probably working on things that you are struggling with more, and things that you're familiar with. Like maybe if you're working in a job where you have to deal with a lot of law things, maybe you're more familiar with that. So maybe you can spend less time on that. Or maybe if you haven't thought about a law case in like 10 years, you should probably focus on that a lot more. But the topics are research and assessment methods, fundamental planning knowledge, which is like planning theory, communication and interaction. So that's like public involvement strategies, things like that. Plan and policy development. So that's really like the planning process. Plan implementation. That covers a variety of things, administration and management, and then leadership. and then areas of practice. So areas of practice, oh, and code of ethics, I should specifically mention that one too, but the areas of practice, that's a big one because it can cover like, oh, all the specific topics within planning: transportation, environment, natural resources, economic development. So that's where you sort of get the more like tangible things, like what a lot of us are probably doing day to day. And a lot of the other topics are more of like what you covered in school probably. So it's a lot to study, but I definitely would echo Erin's recommendation to kind of map out your plan based on those study topics and give yourself a good chunk of time. I think 4 to 6 months is very realistic for how much time you want to give yourself. And again, that depends on how much time you have like per week to spend. But yeah, I would say I spent probably like 4 to 8 hours a week for probably 4 to 6 months. And then once it got closer, obviously like some more cramming happened, but I started quite a bit earlier as well. Yeah, do you see any more questions in here, Erin?
Yeah, I see one more question. Are there any practice exams available to identify weak spots before the final test? So there are practice exams through various websites, Quizlet, that people will type in some of the questions that they have heard in the past. The pool of questions it comes from changes so often though. And it might not even be covered on there, and it could be very specific. So I would recommend looking into some practice exams. I think through Plan Edison, they have practice exams. I'm not exactly sure on that one. But I wouldn't just solely base it on practice exams to understand where your weak spots may be, because not even what's out there on the internet will be asked. It's a large range, like Liz said. And I see Heather has a question too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Cleveland. I am also AICP. And I just wanted to give a couple of cents on my experience. I did the Plan Edison, highly recommend it. It helped give me structure. And like Erin had just mentioned, it does have the practice exams, which I highly recommend. Just to go through that motion, and it helped just get in the frame of mind of how those questions are going to be asked. I also had a study group that I met with weekly, and we would go through those questions and then kind of discuss them together, because I think something that we all struggled with was you have to think like the exam. And so sometimes like the practicality of what you might do is not there. That's not how they're asking you. They're asking you from the perspective of AICP. So that was something that we talked about often amongst our group, and it really helped having that conversation. And then lastly, I just want to add that I made so many flashcards, especially for the law piece of it. I struggled, there's the year and the topic, and I just struggled to remember those. So I made a lot of flashcards and really practiced those over and over.
Yeah, I used a lot of flashcards too. That's a great tip.
Me too. I think I had like 300.
Yeah.
And just making them helped too, so I
Yes.
made them and then I used them. So I thought that was really helpful for me.
Absolutely.
One thing I wanted to note, kind of related to one of the questions, was like if you need a person to check off on your experience. So when you actually get to the point of applying for your experience and education requirements to get your full AICP certification, they will obviously be doing that. But if you're in the point where you're considering taking the exam, but you're not sure if your education or your work experience is going to count, it's probably more likely wondering whether your work experience will count. I'm happy to kind of look or chat with you if you're like, will this count? I mean, there's resources on there where you can try to kind of get a feel for that. But if you're still not sure, you could shoot me an email and even like describe a little bit more about what your work is like and what kind of things you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Or we could just have a phone call and chat about that if you're just not sure. It can be a little bit tricky, honestly, kind of surprisingly. It might seem obvious, but because planning is such a variable field, like there's so many different things planners can work on. For example, I had a friend who was kind of, I think their title was a planner, but they were doing like almost solely GIS work. and not really working on plans. A lot of their GIS work was focused on like internal data analysis and like managing data. And it turned out that they actually were not able to get approved for their experience because their work wasn't really working with the public. They weren't working on plans. So even though they had a degree and everything, that wasn't necessarily enough to make their experience count. So just a couple more things to consider. And I will also add, I did not do the planetism. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to say that right. You guys know what I mean. I did not do that one. I actually purchased a study guide that was previously available through APA, which now they've actually done away with. But I actually would also, if you're not sure about whether you want to purchase something, I would actually also check out the free resources that are now on the APA website. They've really improved those in the last couple of years. There's several videos going topic by topic now that are free. And then there's the Chapter President's Council Guide, which has a very modest fee of, I think, like $30, that I think is another good resource. So again, I would say as a first step to just like map your plan for studying, and then kind of gather your study materials, and then you can decide if you want to purchase something or not.
I guess
Yeah,
one last thing I'll touch on too. I know we talked about it a little bit, but understanding the law cases and really understanding the law cases is something you're not going to be asked everything about every single law case that you're going to study for it, but there will be a selection from all of them. So really try and memorize those, and not just memorize them, but understand them and kind of continue that on to make sure you're up to date with all of them. They can get pretty confusing. The names are similar, but I would recommend organizing it. These are the ones that go for the First Amendment. These are the ones that address the 14th Amendment, due process, things like that. Kind of organize it that way will help you really understand, because they will ask very specific things in the law cases, but not on every single one of them, and you don't know which ones you're going to get asked. So that's one that you should definitely focus on as well.
Yeah, that's great. And also,
it's good things to know on the job too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And just thinking about the timeline, I think at the beginning of the call, I mentioned that maybe I would do another one in early fall, but maybe I'm thinking maybe in the next couple months, maybe in late June or July, I'll do another one talking about the studying, because I think that seems to be something can kind of go through a little bit more detail of each topic. And hopefully if you're planning on the fall exam cycle, that will give you enough time to kind of help use that to map your plan. I also put an invite to join the Slack channel. If you want to do that, that link is good for 30 days. So if you go ahead and go in there and join today, but even if you don't plan on, really thinking about this for another couple months, you could still join and then get those updates when that becomes available. So I think that covers everything I was planning on covering. I know people are probably have other things going on this afternoon, but if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to send me an email at, I'll put my email in the chat, pdo.wapa@gmail.com. And again, like I mentioned, I'm going to be following up with this recording, this presentation, and I'll put those both in an email and on the Slack channel and probably on the APA website too. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a great Friday. And good luck if you are getting started studying.
Bye. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Erin.
Yes, thank you guys.